Hey guys, good morning again and welcome back to Stop Loss with Spencer. Today's topic is actually kind of a two-parter. We're speaking about level funding today and also aggregate accommodation. So aggregate accommodation gets thrown on top of this because one, it's relevant, and two, I forgot to put it in my contract enhancements video, and shame on me, but you guys get to benefit and we get to explain them together. So it just kind of makes sense, right? So level funding. You may have heard of level funding before. You may be interested in what it is. All the cool kids are talking about it in the broker world. Level funding, not very complicated. Actually, just a couple things that turn it into a level funded plan. And we're going to discuss those features today, and then I'll illustrate how it works. And since we're trying to use these videos as an educational type style video, we'll talk about basic level funding. We'll talk about level funding with a carrier, a Cigna level funded, a UHC All Saver, an Aetna AFA, a carrier driven prepackaged level funded plan. You can build your own. I would strongly encourage you to seek out consultants or organizations that will help you put together a level funded plan that takes advantage of it, but maybe strips away some of the downsides to a carrier version. But that's not to diminish what the carriers are doing, and for the sake of this video, we'll explain it as if it was a carrier-driven version of level funding. So the main primary way that this becomes level funding is that you pay a level amount every single month. So it effectively feels like an employer is paying fully insured premium. So you level fund it through a couple different subtle distinctions to a regular partially self-funded plan. And so the primary distinction of a level funded plan is a lower corridor. So if you remember from my attachment point / aggregate corridor video, we talked about that 25% buffer is effectively your standard buffer if you get a stop loss quote from a carrier. Well, in a level funded contract, you're going to squash that threshold from expected claims. You're going to reduce that buffer to something like 110 or 115%. And there's a couple reasons why you do it, but the main reason is you're going to be funding up to that fully funded or maximum liability threshold. So you wouldn't want that 125% corridor most likely, because then it's going to be a little bit extreme. It's likely going to make it difficult to show potential competitive funding levels versus the fully insured option. So they lower that corridor, and one of the reasons is to make it a little bit more palatable as an option. So like I said, you will fully fund or max fund the plan. So what do I mean by that? Well, you pay your admin costs, you pay your stop loss costs, those are your fixed costs, and then the other component of that, of course, is claims. Well, when you level fund a plan, you fully fund it, you max fund it, you're going to use that attachment point, and those claims dollars, you use a monthly attachment factor, or aggregate factor, and you add that on top of those fixed costs, and that becomes effectively your premium number. So you fully fund it, pay for the maximum liability of claims, and that becomes your monthly funding level. You will also usually have a run-out contract, like a 1215, 1218, 1224. I think Cigna's level funded plan is a 1227. You either have that and or terminal liability. It's basically the same thing, right? It's providing a tail on the back end of incurred claims to capture those claims that didn't get paid in that first 12-month incurred period. So you have a tail or a terminal liability, okay? And then aggregate accommodation, that's where that sort of subtopic comes from, the main reason we're discussing level funding. Aggregate accommodation, if you remember back from my aggregate corridor video again, I explained a couple times you might actually go above that monthly threshold. Well, in a normal plan that does not have aggregate accommodation, or a non-carrier version of a level funded plan, if you exceed that monthly threshold, you're funding above that, right? And the only reason you would get, or way that you would get reimbursement on the tail end of that plan, is if you maintained an aggregate position after the end of the policy and the reconciliation period. When you have aggregate accommodation, it actually will cap your exposure to there and reimburse you above that level. However, if you're going back to the simple version, the carrier-driven version, you're not going to have to fund to that excess and then have a reimbursement. They'll just cap it for you and basically carry forward a deficit in the subsequent months until eventually you're most likely going to still land in a position below the aggregate corridor at the end of the year. The difference in a level funded plan versus a self-funded plan, if you're over that attachment point at the end of the year and you didn't have aggregate accommodation in that partially self-funded plan, you'd get a reimbursement back. However, again, the carrier version of this, if you're still above that maximum threshold, you'll just get a bigger renewal. You won't get a surplus or be able to split the surplus with them and get back some of your claims fund that weren't used. If you were above it, they'd basically just say, well, we're not going to ask for more money from you this year, but your renewal is going up next year. Okay? Another really primary reason why this gets used, or maybe the space that it gets used, is that smaller end of the spectrum self-funded plan. So I've seen it down to 20. I've heard it discussed maybe potentially below that. But for all intents and purposes, we're probably talking about 20, 25 on the low end, and maybe 100, 150, possibly 200, depending on the carrier on the top end. This is not a solution for a 10,000 life group, okay? But it does give you an opportunity to experience self-funded, get a little bit of the taste of being self-funded, and it sometimes tastes pretty good. And so you could use this as potentially a transitional product off of that fully insured merry-go-round to give you a little bit more control, give you a little bit more of the experience of different fluctuations in month to month of claims funding. Get a sense of what it's like to pay admin costs and stop loss costs and have a spec deductible and have a contract basis, all those things that are a part of being partially self-funded. But you get the opportunity to do it in a way that's a little bit easier to understand, a way that is a little bit simpler to fund, and has less of the disadvantages on the top end for worst case scenario if you were partially self-funded. So that's why I think this is more of a transitional product. The only time you might not use it as a transitional product is if you're going to stay relatively small. You're probably not going to exceed that top end of that size range. You could potentially do this year after year after year, but you just know you're giving up some things if you don't eventually use it as a way to transition off of. The last feature that I want to discuss, which is really the main reason why I think you would want to explore a level funded product, is because you get some claims data. It's not always going to be the best. It's not always going to be the most robust claims reporting data. But you will get more than you do when you're fully insured. And that's a real plus, because if you cannot determine what's really driving your claims costs, how are you going to combat that? If you can't measure something, you can't manage it, right? And so claims data will give you a little bit of a peek under the hood, a little bit more so than those fully insured arrangements will let you have. And so you can start doing different things, adding in, let's say, a wellness program, or maybe a surgical intervention program, or maybe bill audits or something like that. You're really going to start looking at what's driving those claims costs, and let's deploy some best-in-class bolt-on solutions to start addressing those things so we have a better experience year over year, okay? So that's really it. Like, this doesn't have to be complicated. That's the main reason I'm making these videos, is there doesn't need to be a barrier to entry of knowledge in order to get to this. It shouldn't be something that it's difficult to find this information to educate yourself. And so I really want to stimulate conversation. Please ask me some questions after this. If I mess something up, those of you in the carrier world that sell these products all day, if I misrepresented something, let me know. If you have a question about this, ask it. I'll address it, or maybe pull in some folks that can answer it. But if you don't leave this video better off, have a better understanding of level funded and some of the alternate options that are out there, then I haven't done my job. So if you want to just comment and say, Spencer, you didn't do your job, I'll take that too. But as always, thank you for tuning in. Really appreciate the eyeballs and the ears and the comments and the questions. Thanks again, and I'll see you guys soon, all right? Bye.